All right. All right, now we're gonna stop chit chat and start the official event. So hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for taking time in a very bizarre, strange, hard week here for a lot of people. So it's really great that you took the time to be here today, and we get to take advantage of Inés's amazing knowledge and the fact that it's easy to visit MIT's campus, even now that she's not even on sabbatical in the US anymore. She's now gone back to Madrid and Spain. But I'm really just really pleased to be able to host her here at MIT. And I wanted to just do a little bit of introduction for a little bit about her. And she'll be doing about 40 or so minutes presentation, and then as she speaks, please use the Q&A feature. You can try to use the chat, but I'm going to try to be keeping track of both of those places, and then those will be the questions we have for Inés at the end. So please feel free to ask them as she's going, though, and we'll store them up for after the presentation. So if I were going to do like a real legit full introduction, it would take a really long time because Inés Sánchez de Madariaga is extremely distinguished. She's an internationally recognized expert on gender in research and architecture and planning and development. She's a professor of urban planning, and she's a delegate for gender equality at the Technical University of Madrid. She's been a visiting scholar at Columbia University, the London School of Economics, as well as other places. She's held a variety of positions in various Spanish ministries, advising on various issues of gender inclusion. She has written 10 books and over 40 articles in professional journals and various book chapters. And she's recently co-edited a book with Marian Roberts, which is a reference book on gender in cities, which is called Fair Shared Cities, the impact, yes, Fair Shared Cities. And she's been a PI of over 20 research projects. And I mean, really the list goes on. But I think, one of the things, we originally met at an event last fall in Spain. And it was really inspiring for me to see somebody who's been working at this intersection of gender and planning and doing extremely forward-thinking work for such a long time and really kind of pushing that agenda. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what she has to say today. And I hope this will be a great addition to our community and we can continue to draw on this work going forward. So without further ado, Inés, please take it away from here.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Catherine. I'm really pleased to be able to share with you our experience on getting gender into planning from research to implementation. This is what I would like to share with you today because, as you said, I started doing research on this field over 20 years ago, and covering the fields of planning, architecture, transportation, services, etc. And the result of some of these have been quite a number of publications, both on the content of gender in these areas, of which some of the most relevant are the book you mentioned and some other recent ones, like this one just published by Routledge, Engendering Cities. And also a number of publications on how to get women into research structures and promoting structural change of academia. This has been done in part through a number of projects, particularly European projects, and a lot of networking too. We have built networks of researchers and policymakers in Europe and also beyond Europe through a number of European projects that have allowed us to fund these activities of exchange through short-term scientific missions and different network activities, which have been very fruitful, and some of the books have been the results of these projects. Also, we have now this international framework, a policy framework that sets like an agenda in which the intersection of gender and the urban environment is put forward as one of the key elements of the sustainable development and the new urban agenda. And in Spain, particularly, there has been a policy change in the last few years that has contributed to sustain this movement from research to implementation that has been related to the approval of a number of pieces of legislations, some of which I also was involved with. But what do we mean when we talk about gender in planning? Gender in planning and gender in transportation involves like getting these concepts that were developed within gender studies and what are their spatial implications. Particularly the most important of these concepts that is relevant for the urban environment is the concept of care. It's a key concept because by referring to this paid and mostly unpaid work performed by adult individuals on behalf of children and the old, the sick, and the overall functioning of the household, this concept allows us to understand what are the differences, the different needs and the different aspects that are relevant for men and women when they go about the city, when they go about the use of infrastructure, when they go about the use of facilities, and what are the implications of these differences related mostly to care for planning. And we see that these differences, these gender differences are mainly sex differences because the gender roles are statistically still very much distributed by sex, which is shown by all the statistics regarding the use of time in Europe and in the US as well. And we could very simply see like a scheme of what are the most relevant implications of these gender roles in how we use cities. For people who have both care and work responsibilities, the use of the city is far more complex. You have to go around the city taking care of all these activities that have to do with taking care of kids, taking care of the older or household errands. And this involved specific ways of movement around the city and a more intense use of both infrastructure and facilities. When we translate this into how we have built the discipline and the practice of city planning, we see that the foundations of modern planning, which are for the most part still the basics of how we go about building and transforming our cities, were built around the idea of 4 functions of the city: residential, production, leisure, transportation, and as a means to link all these other facilities in which services take place. And underlying this conceptualization of the city and planning, hence, are some assumptions that are very much related to gender, because these assumptions are based on the personal experience of those who live the city without care responsibilities, which are mostly men. Paid employment is the main focus. Housing is seen as a place for leisure and not for its care implications, and transport is seen as a means to link the spaces assigned to these functions. So when we look at the gender assumptions in planning and transportation, we see these unquestioned ideas that very often are unconscious on gender roles and sexual divisions of labor that are implicit in urban planning practices. And a very clear case in point is the one pointed out by Dolores Hyde in her pioneering work of the late 1970s and early 80s, in which she analyzed the American suburb. And in which she demonstrated so clearly how the experiences and the needs of the persons who assume these care responsibilities are not made explicit and do not receive the same attention nor priority in policy and plans. And when we look at particularly at transportation, there's a very rich literature, a lot of it coming from the US, particularly starting with the Women Issues in Transportation series of conferences funded by the Federal Housing Administration since the late 70s. A very rich body of empirical literature that shows these very consistent gender differences in transportation, in distances, in transport modes. Men travel longer distances, women use more different transportation modes, have less access to private car, travel for a wider diversity of purpose, which are linked obviously to the many different tasks that they undertake on a daily basis for sustaining the life of the family and of the people who cannot move around autonomously in the city. Women's spatial travel patterns are more polygonal and closer to the home, and very significant differences is regards change trips. Women do many more change trips by linking different segments of a trip for different purposes, sometimes even using different modes of transport to accomplish all this complex array of tasks necessary for maintaining daily life. So this field of transportation has a lot of research, and some years ago I developed the concept mobility of care that I proposed as an umbrella concept that quantifies and makes visible these trips made by adults for the care of others and the upkeep of the home, because the existing surveys do not allow to quantify it within the overall mobility because they have gender biases and omissions. So I made this hypothesis using an existing survey done by the Spanish Ministry of Public Works that applied to all metropolitan areas in the country. With the hypothesis that in between 1/3 and 2/3 of the trips normally counted as shopping, visits, strolling, it could be considered as care trips. If we did this very broad assumption, and of course 100% of escorting trips should be considered as care trips, then the number of trips that could be conceptualized as under this umbrella concept of mobility of care would be quite a relevant volume of the overall trips, and could be quite close to those related to employment. So we have applied this concept to a number of cities in Spain and in some other countries, and some of the results of this empirical work that we did developing specific surveys that are able to capture those trips, because normal conventional transportation surveys do not allow to count for these trips because they are not designed for it. They don't ask specific enough questions, so that many of these trips get hidden under other categories or are not counted, maybe because they are shorter than 1 kilometer or shorter than 10 minutes on foot, which those kind of trips very often are not taken into consideration in transportation surveys. So we developed a specifically designed surveys that allow to quantify this, and we have applied it in the city or in the metropolitan area of Madrid for the population 30 to 45. And the result is this, that trips related to employment are only slightly over trips related to care activities. But when we disaggregate this data by sex, the differences is very, very significant, because we can see that while there is a significant gender gap for employment purposes, this gap is much bigger when it comes to care-related trips. And this can explain also why the transportation sector is very much blind to these needs, because it's still a highly masculinized field, and it doesn't. I mean, there's this bias is embedded into the perception, even the personal perception of those who are the most active members of the transportation planning sector. So we did also this analysis for the city of Nairobi in a project for UN Habitat together with a local NGO. And we found that women do one additional trip. That means moving from 3 trips to 4 trips, or 2 to 3 on average for care purposes. And this trip is not shorter than trips to the workplace. This additional trip is for care purposes, and it is not shorter than trips to the workplace. It's done before or after going to work. Women travel longer distances, and also significant is that many women do not travel because of concerns of sexual assault, and men are also concerned about safety, albeit not of a sexual nature, meaning that we also need to take safety issues in transportation regarding women and men into consideration. In addition to this quantitative work related to transportation and this innovative concept that allows to really make visible and quantify the typically feminine mobility related to care, we also do, together with my colleague Inés Novella, these exploratory safety audits with women, which it's a methodology developed originally in Canada already 30 years ago, which is being used around the world, and that allows to identify how the women in the neighborhoods live and understand, and what are their understandings and perceptions about safety and other relevant characteristics of urban space. And we combine this with a technical analysis that we do with our students at the university and mappings. And it's very interesting to overlap the results of what the women identify in these participatory processes with the analysis that result from the work of students. Very often they overlap, and they mostly overlap, and it's a very rich source of understanding of the needs of persons in urban, of women, of different profiles. We profile this according to include different age groups and different ethnic groups when that's the case in a particular neighborhood. We have also done regarding the transportation sector and infrastructure, some work for ADIF. ADIF is the Spanish owner of train and operator of the train and railway infrastructure. They own all the railway systems and the train stations. And they asked us to analyze from a gender perspective and produce a set of recommendations for the redesign of a number of high-speed train stations in the country, some of them very urban, in the big urban station in the center of a mid-sized city, Atocha in San Sebastián, and some others in different urban situations, some of them a quasi rural area with a significant segment of the railway that needed an approach, an almost landscape approach, and also including during the construction process, because these construction processes take quite a long time, and the problems and the issues raised in this environment, particularly in terms of crossings during that period, was also a requirement to be addressed in our work. So we produced a number of recommendations and addressing orientation, accessibility, vigilance, care, maintenance, and visibility in those three stations. And then another field in which we are working is the field of housing. And we have done two projects for two different administrations. One is for the Basque regional government that adopted 2 years ago regional legislation regulating all the housing sector, and it's a legislation that regulates the quality, all the standards of both private market rate and affordable housing in the region. And they asked us to produce a number of recommendations to include legal requirements into this piece of legislation. So we, the issues that were addressed and that were included, this regulation was approved last year. And the issues that were included as legal requirements relate to the minimum size of bedrooms, and this is intended to increase because the previous regulation, the second and third bedrooms, each one could be smaller, and the minimum size was 6 square meters. So we increased this to 10 meters for all of them, so that bedrooms could have a more reasonable size in which other things in addition to sleeping could be done by the different members in the household, so that this would include the versatility and the flexibility in use of the rooms in the housing unit. We also included a regulation on the minimum size of kitchens, so that kitchens can be used by more people, more than one people at the same time. And also some regulation regarding the relationship between the kitchen and the dining space, so that they should be closer, at least have some visual contact, so to make easier all the work related to cooking and the cycle of food in the home, and increased standards for storage, some criteria for security design of common spaces, and so on. So these minimum requirements that we established, I think that the pandemic has demonstrated how important thinking of these issues is, because the pandemic has shown how our housing stock is not really prepared to be used 24 hours a day by all the members of the family, with kids studying and parents working in it. And then we have also produced a pre-normative study on gender and housing for the national government, with recommendations for national level upcoming new housing legislation. This was a study with general recommendations. It was not as precise as the one that we did for the Basque government, in which the result was the actual writing of the legal requirements that have been actually included into the piece of legislation. The national legislation is still in process, so we'll see what comes out finally through it. And then I would like just to show you two more projects. The first one is one at the regional scale. We have done two main at large scale. We have produced two main pieces of work. One is a technical annex to the new regional land use law of the region of Extremadura. Land use legislation in Spain is a regional competence, so it's the regions who do legislation regarding land use, and the government of Extremadura asked us to produce a technical annex addressing gender topics for all the planning instruments, from the territorial, regional to the urban and the sublocal level. And then the Basque government asked us to make recommendations to get gender into the regional plan, which was approved 3 years ago. This is the one I'm going to talk to you about a little bit more. This document includes the key aspects to consider. So what are the key things to look at when you want to get gender issues into a regional plan? You need to look at gender roles, unpaid care work, sexual divisions of labor, and their impact on the use of the city by men and women. You need to look at gender perceptions of safety in urban space and transportation and their impact on women's access to employment and services. And then at the feminization of poverty and intersections of gender with other factors, including female household heads, age, ethnicity, immigration, and disability. And of course, issues of participation in decision-making, participatory processes, getting gender expertise into the process, and the administrative structures for implementing the gender mainstreaming policy. So the urban model that we suggested to be included is that of an urbanism of care. So our recommendations would take the concept of care and its implication for planning and transportation as the core, and the actions and measures proposed are centered on this idea of care. Of the regional plan of the Basque Country has 8 thematic domains. So we advise to have to focus the recommendations on just 4 domains to be more effective, not to want to cover everything and then not really have the actual possibility to implement too many things. So really to be selective and strategic. And so we recommended to act on these 4 areas, the 4 thematic areas of the plan: urban environment and territorial planning, sustainable mobility, governance, and rural environment. And as an example, I have listed here the lines, the groups of recommendations or lines of actions for the domain of urban environment and planning. The first one, which I think it's the most important of them, is compulsory indications for land reserves for care facilities within municipal land use plans and zoning regulations. Care facilities implying facilities for mostly for the care of the elderly and children. And this is land reserves is a technique of the Spanish land use system that is used to obtain the land for schools, sports, health facilities, all the facilities that are required by law. So our proposal is that care facilities get the same treatment under the planning legislation that today have basic services that are recognized universally and are subject to standards under the land use law, such as education, health, sports, and so on, so that care facilities get the same status and they get land reserves within normal ongoing plan zoning regulations. A second one is to develop plans for care facilities for the elderly, toddlers, and children, pilot projects through open calls and public competitions, financial incentives for gender-related actions, including in programs, plans, and projects by local governments, guidelines, manuals, and briefings for good practice for gender mainstreaming, comprehensive plans and regeneration projects, specific measures to be integrated in housing plans. Housing plans are municipal, but also regional. Identification of locations considered as unsafe through participatory processes and actions for improving safety. And then guidelines, briefings, and manuals for public space design and public facilities to be developed by both the regional and the municipal governments. As a summary of the basic recommendations for gender mainstreaming in planning that arise from this work are these recommendations that we cover sufficient substantive domains of planning so that we don't get stuck just in 1 or 2 areas, such as would be maybe safety or transportation, but that we need to really look at a sufficiently broad substantive domains of planning, that regulatory changes needed for continuity in time are established, that small scale and large scale actions are combined, that pilot projects are used as instruments for innovation, learning, dissemination, and visibility, that intersectionality is taken into account, that women-targeted actions are combined with mainstreaming measures, so that mainstreaming doesn't make specific actions targeted to women disappear from the policy options, that sufficient elements with transformative capacity are integrated, and of course, institutional capacity building and the creation and use of expert knowledge are also brought into the picture. And then the second project, and this is the last project I would like to talk to you today, is one of urban regeneration. We have done several of those, and the one I'm going to talk to you is this one, Madrid Nuevo Norte, which is a big redevelopment project in the north of the city of Madrid, in which we have done 2 things. We have advised and worked with the design and engineering teams that have designed the overall master plan of this project. And also we have drafted the gender impact assessment of the plan, because this plan is technically a modification of the general urban plan of the city of Madrid. It involves the construction of over new 10,100 housing units, 20% of which at least will be social housing, a new central business district. This amount of office and housing space, and the construction of a new intermodal transport hub, including the main Spanish high-speed train hub, several new metro stops, new high-occupancy bus lines, a number of new road streets, the conversion of some urban roads that are today almost roads into urban streets, and so on. This is the master plan of the project. And what we did for this, as I said, was the technical assistance during the design. We did some training for the technical staff and also for the social engagement department working in the project and managers. And we also worked in aspects related to social inclusion in neighborhoods around the intervention, doing exploratory walks, safety audits with women, neighborhood women, which included workshops, meetings, etc., with women in all the neighborhoods around the project, which are neighborhoods of quite different profile, some of them quite run down and with a number of social and urban problems, some other rather middle class, more modernly built, recently built areas, but still with some urban issues because of excess of open space and exceedingly too low density, particularly. The topics that we covered in this work, particularly by the gender impact assessment, which, as I say, is a technical report that is part of the technical documentation of the plan, includes transportation at all modes and scales, public space at all scales, residential areas and housing, again, at all scales, the central business district and office space, because the project has smaller scale centers for economic activities spread throughout the residential areas. Then the facilities, the public and private, all kinds, and some historical heritage buildings that are in the area. And this was done at the master plan level, covering structural issues, borders, interaction with the surrounding areas, and at the urban design level for each of the 4 sub-areas as defined by the master plan, which is there. And so as just a couple of examples of what we did. We contributed to the design and also to the impact analysis. For instance, regarding housing and residential areas, at the neighborhood scale, we recommended that the urban regulations would include for urban planning projects that is a different level of planning that goes after the plan that we're addressing now. So what the plan that we're addressing now says is that for the next more detailed planning scale, that is the next planning instrument that will follow for urban planning projects, a gender responsive report is mandatory to justify if the project meets basic requirements related to gender equality and support of care. And also the urban regulations include a number of regulations regarding safety concerns that mostly address minimum lighting in urban space according to a gender criteria. Here we applied the standards defined by the city of Vienna on how to regulate the minimum lighting in urban space. So you see, what we were doing is to postpone whatever cannot be regulated at the planning level with the planning instrument that we're working on and needs to be addressed at a more detailed scale. We established the requirements that need to be covered at this next planning scale. And so for the building block scale, we established that the building projects regulation should again have a gender responsive report mandatory to justify if the project meets basic requirements related to gender equality and care, addressing common areas and safety. And that buildings should include a specific room to store bikes, pushing chairs, wheelchairs, or any other system supporting care mobility. Gender criteria would include the location on ground floor or very accessible, good lighting, and design and materials that would allow visual control. And then at the at the scale of the building projects regulation, were included requirements on fences to allow again for visual control and permeability, and that building regulations would promote mix of uses, that lower floors allow non-residential use, that common areas are flexible and adaptable, including co-working, meeting, informal care of childhood, and elderly, and extra storage. So this was done. This is just an example of things that were included in the residential parts as recommendations or requirements. But this was done regarding all the other planning domains that I mentioned before. So this is some of the work that we have done at different scales and at different planning domains of planning. We have been organizing this series of international conferences for a number of years now. Many of them we did under the network funding by the European Commission during 4 years, and now we are continuing doing them on a permanent basis. And these series of conferences are very useful to exchange knowledge with colleagues around Europe and the world. We are also a very important part of our activity relates to education and training, and in addition to formal education that we do within our master's program, in which I teach a course on gender and planning, we do specific training to decision makers and technical staff and researchers from local governments, regional governments, national governments, private companies, and research institutions. And at this moment, we are part of this European project called GE Academy, which provides tools and a number of resources on gender equality, both from the point of view of promoting women and structural change of organizations and how to do gender equality plans, and also on how to get gender considerations into a number of substantive fields of policy, among which are transportation, urban planning, climate change, and other related ones to the built environment. So just to finish, I don't know if I have one more minute. Catherine, do I have one more minute?
You do.
Okay, so I just wanted to share with you some thoughts about the current scenarios with the COVID pandemic, because we are seeing and their implications for gender and planning, because we are seeing big changes related to gender issues that we don't know exactly what implications will have, but we're also seeing important transformations in cities. The first one is what we're doing now, teleworking. What will be the impact of teleworking on cities? So on this slide, I will just show a number of these changes, and then I will, in the next slide, show some of the urban implications. So we're seeing increased telework, reduced female employment. Big numbers of women are getting expelled from the labor force, and probably an overall reduced income, at least in certain parts of the world. We don't know how long this will last, but that can be significant. We will probably see a reorganization of provision of work, of care between families, markets, public services, formal and informal, collaborative local networks, third sector, and nonprofits. For instance, the issue of the provision of elderly care, which has been the place where more people have died during the pandemic. In some countries, I think, such as Spain, it places a strong sign of I don't know how to say it in English. I mean, the attention to what's happening, to how we have built those services that have not been able to protect our elderly. And then sexual divisions of labor. During the pandemic, we have seen that women have bore the biggest part of care, even when they have been the ones also working in the home. So will there be more or less female participation in the labor force? It looks like there will be less. And this will probably bring us to think about whether care can be recognized as work. And this old vindication of wages for housework, when some extension of public protection systems with basic safety nets are being considered, at least in some European countries, and how this basic economic coverage of the population should be considered from a gender perspective and take gender care as part of the way those systems are designed, if ever they get to be designed, which probably will. And then what will be this overall reorganization of care and the formal economy? I think we need to think about that. And then another important thing, I think, relates to lifestyle. And this is probably a desideratum that I think that after this, a thing that should come out, that would be good that it comes out, is that we all live with more austerity, not only the poor and the middle class. And this, of course, would imply a number of things related to role models, social media culture, and so on, and also obviously of personal decisions. So it looks that we will have shrinking middle classes, increased poverty, and that will have a disproportionate impact on women. So what urban implications? We have seen that our housing stock in most parts of the world is not prepared to live and work. There are physical, spatial limitations, and this will require a renovation of housing stock and a rethinking of the of whatever new housing will be produced in the coming years. This will imply urban regeneration of neighborhoods, and it will also imply looking at affordability issues. There is being a big affordability crisis during this and problem of paying rents and mortgages, and depending on how bad the economic crisis comes out of the recession, I think that significant sections of the populations in many countries will not be able to afford housing in the conditions that is being provided today. So this will require a very fresh look to housing provision, both in terms of design and spatial characteristics and affordability issues, with their gender perspective, obviously. And then the workspaces, teleworking that has speed up. It was going to happen, but it has happened suddenly and very fast. This will imply, and many of it will stay. So quite a bit of current office space will be redundant. Of course, if housing is not adequate to telework, once the pandemic is over and we can meet in reasonable terms, co-working space in neighborhoods will be the solution so that commuting trips will be avoided. And so what will be the effects of this on the office market particularly? And then e-commerce, that is increasing a lot and will be increasing even more. This will have an impact on the local provision of retail. And it will have implications at the local level regarding particularly the logistics of the last mile and the storage at local neighborhood level of the products before this last mile distribution to the homes. And again, facilities. We need to do a more efficient use of existing facilities, 24 hours, that particularly in countries which are middle income countries that don't have such an extraordinary provision of facilities. So those existing facilities at the local level, that they are used more efficiently. And then we need to rethink the whole model of elderly care, at least in my country, and the model of childcare. with increased diversity of provision, with the architectural solutions and the regulations of how the service is provided, and how this can be more related to home solutions, probably of different sizes and systems of regulation, as is being done particularly in some countries, like in France. They have a very diversified, very interesting system of childcare provision. And then regarding to transportation, and this is just the end now, we have seen a redistribution of transportation modes during the pandemic, redistribution and redesign of public space with temporary solutions, some of which might be good to become, some not, but some probably were good enough, thought out, that might stay after the pandemic is over. And we are seeing, this is a bit contradictory, because we are seeing reduction, but then also increase. But overall, this was a trend that was before the pandemic, that private cars, we will see a reduction in the use of private cars, increased variety of vehicles, and increased reliance on, we should aim at an increased reliance on public transportation modes and non-contaminating modes. Yeah, and again, another very important aspect regarding transportation has to do with the increased flexibility in services. This is particularly relevant for women. Special complementary and ad hoc services that can be designed to reach specific distant locations or at times of night, in specific or for specific off-hours working sectors. So what we will see overall is like variations in travel patterns with reduced commuting, hopefully, due to the increase of telework, but probably an increase of local trips. This is unclear, but hopefully an overall reduction of travel demand. So I just finished, and I thank you, and I'm waiting to hear your comments and questions, hopefully. And just to finish, I would like to point out this project, the Gendered Innovations, that is a project by the European Commission and the University of Stanford, in which I'm chairing the Planning and Transportation subgroup. And it's the second edition is going to be published in the coming weeks. So just stay tuned to it. It will provide very interesting new cases. Yeah. Thank you.
Yay, thank you. My one tiny clap is substituting for 40 other claps. So thank you so much, Inés. And yeah, once that comes out from the Gendered Innovations group, you can send it to me, and I'm happy to circulate it around here.
Great.
I think that would be great to see it.
I will.
We have a lot of questions, actually. So
please.
I might take a quick moderator privilege to ask one quick, I think is a quick question, and then we have like 5 or 6 other questions. So we'll try to see how many we can get to. So the work is amazing, and I love the framing around care and like urbanism of care. I think is just a really like really grounding concept to be able to think about this work. The one question I have is, what is the status right now, or like how do folks who have been looking at gender in planning think about gender as a non-binary construct? So like, are there folks who are looking at trans and non-binary folks' usage of the city and how we might design for them as well? Or is the research in this area in more of like a binary gender framework? How do you think about this?
It's mostly on a binary framework until now. In terms of actual implementation of planning. This is what is in our regulation. It's what is in legislation. The European Commission in the Treaty of Amsterdam, which is the covenant of all the European countries to create the European institution, includes gender equality between women and men. It's like the European Constitution. It's not a constitution, it's a treaty. And so this has permeated into national legislations. It was signed in '89, and it gets the concept of gender mainstreaming as defined in the Beijing Women's Conference of '95. So that's the legal grounding of all this work, and that has been filtered down to national planning legislation, national equality legislation, and then regional land use planning and regional gender equality. Now, more recently, we are getting legislation addressing LGBTQ, generally speaking, but not in the specific field of planning. So let's say that the legislation is what is the point of inflection from which we have moved from research into this set number of projects that I have explained. They are all very recent. They are of the last 5 years. Before 5 years ago, nobody was doing anything. It was already written in the law, but the thing that changed and was a court sentence canceled a plan for not having gender impact statement. And so after that happened, the governments have started to implement it. So it comes from the legal system.
Yeah.
More clear in research. I mean, there's very little research on what are really the urban implications from the point of view of planning, of what can be addressed by planning, because planning is a very technical thing that addresses physical space. And then the implications for women are very clear, but for LGBTQ are not so clear.
Thank you. That's super helpful. Thank you. So we have now we have more questions even. We have 3 minutes. So so I'll give priority to the first question that came in, which was from Yusol Kim. She asks, what were some of the unintended consequences, both positive and negative, on, I think this was in the part where you're talking about the feminist design recommendations and legislation, where we're talking about like recommending so much space for these different amenities and things like this. Did you observe any unintended consequences? And maybe just to expand that, because this might end up being our last question, like, have you seen any unintended consequences of this work more generally? Like, have there been any unintended consequences of like the gender impact assessments, or like things that you didn't expect to happen, and then you see some of the results?
It's still too early to know.
Yeah,
so it's a long-term thing. It's long-term business. So many of these things they are still in the planning stage or the legislative, and they have not still been transforming physical space. You see, it's too early to know what's the impact of these things.
Okay, that's great. Okay, the next that I'll ask here is also very specific. I think this would be a fast question. Can you please, it's from Yancili Lozano, can you please share the instrument used to audit the streets by women? Yes. What's the reference for that?
Yes, the reference is the city of Montreal and the city of Toronto in the 1990s. And you can look, they produced a very nice toolkit in French, really good. It's available on the internet if you look for it. I mean, the exact reference, I could look for it and send it to you. I have PDF on my computer. But in any case, it's a very well recognized methodology that is applied by UN Women and by UN Habitat and many cities around the world. And it uses 5 principles: to see and be seen, to hear and be heard, to be able to escape, the order of the environment, and working with the community. And with these principles, you have first a workshop with the local women. You show them some maps, because most of them have never worked with any maps, so that they get an idea of what it is. And then you walk with them with the area, and then you gather all of this and analyze it and give it back to them to get feedback. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, if you share that, I can also circulate that with folks. And actually, we have a student who I noticed is here. Hi, Maria Lucia. She is working on doing something similar audit in Mexico City, actually, using the same protocol. So, so I'm so glad. Yeah, she says hi in the chat. So I think, it's 1 o'clock. I think we're going to end there, but some really provocative questions were still here in the chat. So like, and I'll list them out, but we're not going to answer them today. But how do you avoid duplicating work? Since there's multiple UN agencies that are sometimes working on similar issues. How do you avoid duplication of studies? Yuan, who's a faculty in our department, is saying that he's very interested about how to think about these post-COVID cities from a gender-informed perspective, and how do we create equitable shared space. And then finally, Özlem says, from the care work perspective, we need to recognize the workload on women, and that's very critical. How do we get a little more radical? Is there anything we can do as urban planners to take action to balance the workload on the individuals? So just so you know what some of the feedback is and questions are that are surfacing.
Can you send them to me?
Yeah, I'll copy it all and I'll send to you.
And if anyone wants to contact me directly, I'm very happy.
So here's all of Inés's contact information. And yeah, thanks. One of the things I noticed is I think we got a really big participation, like sort of half MIT, half outside of MIT. So thank you to all the folks who came in from the public as well. Thanks for joining us today. And thank you so much to Inés for being here and sharing just, I think, incredible work. Like, and it's going to be really great to see the work unfold, and then to see what are the consequences, how do we assess it later, what sort of happens as a result of this. So thank you so much. And
thank you very much.
Hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you. Right. Thank you to you, Catherine. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.